First of all, a big thank you to İhlas for inviting me here, and a big congratulations to İhlas for putting on this conference for a second year. What a magnificent conference it is. Last year we enjoyed it so much. And what a big effort it is, what a big commitment from the school and from all the teachers who made it possible, and done such a professional job. Have you got the copy of Story Inc? Have you seen it yet? The magazine. Isn't it a marvelous, marvelous thing? When I first saw it, when I came here, I couldn't believe my eyes. Such a professional job. And such a commitment to the idea of story. Not surprising, really, because the food we eat makes our bodies. The minerals and vitamins in food make our bodies. And the ideas and the feelings, the values, perceptions, and behaviors in stories make our minds. So the food we eat makes our bodies, and the stories we hear make our minds, make us who we are. I love telling stories, but I love thinking about stories. I'm obsessed by the idea of stories. And I've come down to just three kinds of story. One is the fictional story, and I don't need to say that to Turkish people because this is such a rich country. The diversity that Tomasz was talking about has given you such a history, such a heritage of stories. From, let's see if I can pronounce it correctly, but Dede Korkut, many years ago. And then, of course, through the Karagos and Hasivat, the wonderful shadow theatre tradition, and all that creative storytelling. Ongoing, because as you know, they didn't know the actual words when they began. They had the storyline in their heads. Some of them are still working in Istanbul. And of course, Nasreddin Hoca, that we're all so fond of. Storytellers all around the world know your Nasreddin Hoca. I heard a story from my friend just a few days ago, which I'd like to tell you. Nasreddin Hoca was sitting with some of his friends having a coffee. A nice Turkish coffee, I'm sure it was. And they were looking back at their lives, and then one of them said, very philosophically, you know, when I'm lying in my casket, the time has come. I'd like people to look down at me, and I'd like people to say, he was a great innovator. And then the second friend thought for a moment or two, yes, I'd like them to look down at me and say, he was a great teacher. What about you, Nasreddin Hoca? He said, well, I would like them to look down at me and say, he's still breathing. I can identify with that story. I want to be still breathing. I can't retire. I'm 74 years old. I can't retire. Stories are going to be with me. I'm still breathing. So one kind of story, the fiction story. Another kind of story, the factual story. All of us storytellers last night were looked after by your colleagues, your İhlas colleagues, wonderfully, as always, taken around this great city. And of course, we were telling stories, but actually the stories we told were very much about our lives. That is a very important part of storytelling. It is storytelling. Again, in your culture, you have now Gazi Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He is part of the facts of the stories of the nation. And I understand that even his name is full of stories. I believe that the name Kemal was given by his mathematics teacher, is that right? And I believe it was given to him as meaning he's come of age, he's now mature. So even within this, do you teachers always give your students names which they keep for the rest of their lives? That's a wonderful idea. I like that very much. I believe there are more stories which many people know. I understand that people are not quite sure when he was born because of the moon calendar, and so he decided it was May the 19th, 1881. And then I believe there was even an argument in the family about when he was born. His mother, perhaps, this is what mothers do, remembers him being born on a lovely spring morning, a warm spring morning. His sister says, no, you weren't. You were born in the night in a thunderstorm. So this idea of stories from our real life. And then the third kind of story is much more difficult for me to explain, perhaps because I haven't got it clear in my own head. But I'm helped by the idea of Shakespeare. All the world is a stage, and all the men and women are merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. By the way, I don't know why Shakespeare said they have their exits and their entrances. It was that way around, I think. It sounds better to me to say they have their entrances and their exits. And every man in his time plays many parts. This idea of story, this idea that we're actually living in every moment of our lives, living in a story, is a very powerful notion to me. What it would mean is that this is a story, so this is a story about a story. Your school is, İhlas school, is one of the stages on which you're walking and working and living every day. And the atmosphere that you create and that the school, the administration creates, is story making. And then you'll go home to another stage on which your stories are unfolding. And we think, when we turn the page of the story, we think we know what might happen. And very often it does happen. But sometimes you turn the page and something happens which you didn't expect. And that is a story that we live in. Things that we don't expect, as well as the things that we do. So that's another part of our stories, those three kinds of stories. What I'd like to do now is to give you examples from my life. I hope you don't mind that. From my life, from these three kinds of story. But to ask you to very much think about your own, because everybody here has their equivalents. You all have a mother. And I'm going to start talking about my mother, first of all. Now, last year I did tell a story about my mum, and I'd like to tell it again. I'm going to tell two stories about my mum. Remember, stories make us. It is who we are. Everything I'm doing now is partly derived from my mother all those years ago. During the Second World War, not the First World War, I was a little boy. I'm not so old. During the Second World War, I was a little boy. My father was away as a soldier for 6 years. He left in 1939, came home in 1945. So I was just with my mum and my big brother. I lived in Sheffield. The German planes were wanting to bomb the city because it was the steel city of Britain. One night, the house next door was blown up. Many, many nights I was carried into the air raid shelter by my mum. She taught me to recognize the German planes coming over. So her husband was away, bombs were dropping, and one day my toy car didn't work, my little clockwork car. And so I said to my mum, "Mum, can we go to the shop and get it mended?" And she turned the car over and she said, "Look, made in Germany." She said, "We should be mending children's toys, not fighting wars." She said nothing against the Germans, even at that moment. Gosh. You have your stories. That's one of the bricks in the foundation of who I am. Now another story. Those war years were actually wonderful for me because my mother was a person full of curiosity. We loved to go on walks, and she was interested in everything. The flowers and the trees, the birds, history, humps and bumps in the ground, geology. She went through a long period of being very interested in geology. And so we would go for walks, and I was only a little boy, but I had to carry a haversack because she found stones, and somebody had to carry them. Ah, magnesium limestone, she said, and put it in the haversack in my back. I'm sure that's why I'm very rounded now, even as I walk now, because I had to carry all these stones when I was 5 years old. Ah, oolitic limestone, she said, and dropped it in the bag. So I was brought up with this interest in everything around me. Thanks to my mum. It is who I am. Before I could really read, she read me, I remember, Rupert, a bear, living out a life, going to the shops. And in every story of Rupert, if he went to the shop, something wonderful happened. He went on some great adventure. And then when I learned how to read, maybe because I was just a child of my times, I read books about boys, young men going off to sea. All my books were to do with the sea. Of course, Robinson Crusoe, and Treasure Island, and Westward Ho, and all the Hornblower books. I became an expert. I could have sailed a three-masted ship in those days as a child. But I was brought up with the idea of going. And those were not the days when you just bought an airplane ticket and went to another country. You had to wait for the winds to change, to be favorable. And if there was a calm, you would be calmed. A storm, it could be the end of you. And so I was brought up with that idea of going. And it wasn't just an idea. When I was 14, I had my bicycle, I took my tent, and I went away from home for 2 weeks. My mum and dad didn't know where I was. I actually went from the middle of England all the way to Devon and Cornwall by myself. Because for me, it was a normal thing to just go. So I'd like to tell you now a little bit about my traveling and some of the people that I've met on my travels and some of the stories that they've told me. So it's the stories about real people, that one kind of story, and then the stories that they've told me, the fictional stories. Now, right, Japan. I had a wonderful invitation to tour there, telling stories. And I went to 19 cities in 21 days, sent from one town to another. What a privilege. And it went quite well. And it was really ridiculous. I was given a job in a university because of it. I became a professor of English, which is ridiculous. Storytellers aren't meant to be professors of English. Jan Toop, are we meant to be professors of English? We're storytellers. Well, there I was, a professor of English in Chubugakuin University. And I didn't know what to do with myself. It was a very small town. I didn't know anybody, and nobody spoke English. I went to restaurants every evening and just hoped I'd meet somebody. And then one evening, a European man came into the restaurant. Oh, I couldn't believe it. I was waving to him. I wanted him to sit with me. He was wearing a raincoat. When he came up to the table to say hello, I said, "Let me take your coat. Please sit with me." He gave me his raincoat and I dropped it. It was the heaviest raincoat I've ever tried to carry. I said, "Good heavens, why is your raincoat so heavy?" He said, "I've got lead in my pockets." Lead, you know the metal? PB, the very heavy metal, in his pocket. I said, "Why have you got lead in your pockets?" And his answer was, "I've got lead in my shoes as well." I said, "Well, why have you got lead?" As a story man, I knew a story was coming. So we sat down together to have our food. And I said, "Now, come on, tell me. Why have you got lead in your pockets and lead in your shoes?" He said, "I used to do a bit of walking. I'm trying to get fit again." "What do you mean you used to do a bit of walking? Tell me." He said, I remember this is a little restaurant in a remote part of Japan, and here was an Englishman telling me, I have walked further than anybody in recorded history. 7 world records in the Guinness Book of Records. I've walked from Tierra del Fuego to the North Alaskan coast. It took me 7 years. I began with my then girlfriend, Yoshiko. We loved each other very much, but we didn't have a language in common. So there was a misunderstanding. She thought she was on a short holiday. But she was a good girl. She adapted to it because that's what Japanese people do. She was very philosophical. But halfway up South America, she became pregnant because that's what girls do. So she flew home, and she flew back again to Mexico with the baby. It was 2 years old. And we took a little wooden hut by the sea, and it was a very happy time, but she became pregnant because that's what girls do. And so she flew back again to Japan, and then she flew back again when I got up into Alaska, and the 4 of us finished the walk together. Isn't that a wonderful story? That's just because there was a man wearing a raincoat coming into a restaurant, and he sat down with me. Now, 7 years. Hold that in your mind. A man walking from Tierra del Fuego all the way through the Americas to the North Alaskan coast. About the same time, I was working in London for the BBC summer school for English teachers, and I met a Chinese man there. I had my lunch with him. Haley Yi, he said his name was. Remember this 7 years from George Megan, by the way, the walker. So I got to know Haley Yi. And he told me about his life during the Cultural Revolution in China. He was just a village man. He was just a village man, but they realized that he was a very intelligent man. And they decided that he was an intellectual. They had to carry a board hanging on his chest saying, "Running dog of the Americans" on it. And then on the day when he was going to get married, a big car came to the village, he told me, and they bundled him into the car and took him away. And his wife-to-be of that very day ran down the road. He turned, he could see her through the window, waving, "Haley Yi, Haley Yi." And they took him away for 7 years. They took him away many hundreds of miles to a brick-making factory. They were making bricks out of mud. And his job for 7 years, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, was to stand in a pool of mud, 5 meters across, about this deep. And there were 2 water buffalo in the mud. And the idea was that the water buffalo's legs, 8 legs from 2 buffalo, would stir up the mud. But he said, with a lovely smile, such a gentleman, he said, "You know, buffaloes are very clever. If they can, they put their feet in the hole left by the previous foot, because it's less work." And so my job was this. I had to carry 2 things. I had to carry a long stick and a big tin can. That was my job in the mud for 10 hours a day. And when they put their feet in the hole which had been left by the previous foot, I had to smack their legs. And the can, when they wanted to do their pee-pee, I had to dive forward and catch the pee-pee because that would have spoilt the mud bricks. For 7 years, almost at the same time when George Megan was walking from Tierra del Fuego to the Alaskan coast and getting into the Guinness Book of Records, when he was walking like that, Haley Yi was walking round and round with 2 buffalo, smacking their legs and diving forward with his tin can for the same 7-year period. That's not in the Guinness Book of Records. How many people do amazing, wonderful, terrible things in sacrifice, unnamed, unknown. And a few other people will do something which we select and put into the Guinness Book of Records. When he went home, after that 7-year period, his wife-to-be and family were no longer there. And his family said, no, you know, you're getting on, you should be married, and we've found you a good wife. She's a farmer. She'll look after you. She can't read or write, but she's a good woman. And Haley said, so I married her, and she was a good woman. She is a good woman. But then she was called an intellectual, and she had to wear the same thing on her chest, saying, running dog of the Americans. Indeed, there was one day, he said, when the villagers were getting angry with us, and one of them was on the tractor, and he reversed the tractor suddenly and knocked over my wife and broke her leg. And I had to get a hand cart. And I had to pick her up and put her on the cart, and nobody helped me because she was an intellectual, although she was illiterate. And I pushed her to the hospital, which was a few miles away, and when I got there, the great iron gates were closed against me. They said, no, you're not bringing her in here. I said, but she's a farmer. And then he said something amazing happened. And even as I tell you now, I can just tell you what he told me. You will decide. A big car came to the hospital. He had to move his handcart with his wife on it to one side so the car could come up to the gates. But the car was very close to him. He was next to the back window of the car. And as he was standing there holding the cart and trying to calm his wife, the window of the car came down. And he said to me, Andrew, guess who was in there? It was the woman that I was going to have married. She'd become a famous doctor. I hadn't seen her for all those years. And she said, hey, Lee, what's happening? And I could hardly speak. I said, my wife has broken her leg. They won't let us into the hospital. They have to let me into the hospital. And she opened the door of the car, and the two of them carried Haley, his wife, into the back of the car, and they drove into the hospital. Gosh. If you want to follow this up, he wrote a book called Mr. China's Son. Well, there we are. Stories, gosh, aren't they gripping stories from somebody's life? But he is a wonderful man. And he's a great storyteller of traditional stories. And I'd like you to tell you one of the stories that he told me now. He's, by the way, from the Yunnan province, which is southwest China, from the Bai people. And I think this story is from those Bai people. The word you need to know here, let me dwell on it for a moment, is brocade and embroidery. All right, so let me talk about just for a moment, because that's very important that you understand that word. So if you have a big piece of cloth and you have colored silks, you can weave onto the silk pictures. Now you know what I mean. There was an old woman, an old widow, who had 3 sons. They lived in a small house at the foot of a mountain. Now this old woman was wonderful at embroidery. She was so good at embroidery that the sons didn't need to work. She did her embroidery, which she enjoyed doing, and every few weeks she went to the local market and sold her embroidery and could buy rice and everything that was needed. And the boys grew up into young men and they didn't expect to work. But the years went by, and one day as she was going into the town to sell her embroidery, she looked into a shop and saw a picture of a big house and a garden. And in the garden there was a pond, clear water and fish in the pond, and there was a fountain. An orchard down one side of the house with red fruit in it, and on the other side of the house a vegetable garden, rich green cabbages and bright yellow melons. And beyond there were cornfields and distantly rice fields, and she thought, what a beautiful house. I loved that house. Blue roof and green walls and red pillars. She loved that picture. It was the first time in her life that she'd seen something that she wanted for herself, not just giving to her sons. And so she sold her embroidery, and she didn't buy rice. She went back to the shop and she bought the picture. And on the way home, she kept stopping to look at the picture. And it became a dream for her. If only I could live in that house. And when she got home, she said to her 3 sons, look at my pictures. This is a wonderful place. I would like to live in such a place so much. And the 2 older sons said, but where's the food? Where's the rice? I didn't get any. I just took the picture. What are we going to do? And the younger son said, Mother, we will sort that out. We can go off and get wood from the forest. We'll be all right, Mother. Now, listen, this is just a picture. But you are a wonderful picture maker. And you can make pictures really live. So why don't you make a copy of this picture with your embroidery? And that will become yours and you will be in it then. What a good idea. So lots of new silks and a lovely big new piece of cloth on the frame, and she began. And the 3 boys went out into the forest every day looking for wood, and they collected it and they made do. They were able to live. The 2 older boys were always complaining, saying, oh, come on, Mom, stop doing that picture. Do some other things that you can sell. We don't have to work so hard. And the youngest said, please leave her alone. She's worked for us all her life. Now it's her turn. Right, she must do it. And so she worked steadily. And as the months went by, of course, she was tired, her eyes were tired. And the smoke in that little house also was going to her eyes. Her eyes were sore, and tears dropped onto the picture. And where they fell onto the pond, the water was so clear, and fell onto the fountain, was so clear. And another year went by, and sometimes her eyes bled, and the red blood dropped onto the flowers, and they were the brightest crimson flowers you could ever see, and onto the setting sun. The picture was so beautiful. When the picture was finished, the old woman said, let's take it outside so we can see it properly in the sunshine. They took the picture outside, and as they laid it down, a wind came from the west and whisked the picture away into the heavens and away to the east. The poor woman, it was too much for her. And they had to carry her back into the house and put her on a bed. It was too much, she'd lost it. And then the oldest son said, listen, Mother, I will go and try and find it. And he put on his straw sandals and off he went. Off he went to the east, and he walked and walked for a long, long way for many days until he came to a mountain. He climbed the mountain, he came to a cave. There was an old woman sitting in the cave, and next to the cave was a stone horse, appearing to reach out to a tree which was next to the horse, which had red berries on it. And the old woman in the cave said, why are you here? What are you looking for? I think I know, but tell me. Oh, my mother made a beautiful picture, and a wind whisked it away and took it to the east. Yes, that's what happened. I know. The spirit maidens from the Sun Mountain in the east have taken it. They caused that wind to whisk it away. You can get it, but it will be difficult. I can tell you. and you can decide what you want to do. First of all, you must start walking to the east. Excuse me. Koleji. Behind every teller is the teller. Koleji. You didn't tell me that. What Koleji told me was, first of all, oh yes, I think I didn't want to tell you this because it's so horrible. The old woman said to him, first of all, you must take a stone and knock out 2 of your teeth. No wonder I left that out. Knock out 2 of your teeth. And then take those teeth and put them into the stone horse. And then the stone horse will reach out for the berries and will eat 10 of those red berries. And then you can ride the stone horse. Yes. So that's what he listened to, and he thought to himself, I don't think I can do that. But she continued, and when you're on the horse, you will go over the mountains, the fiery mountains, and the flames will be licking at your legs. And if you show any sign of pain, if you just gasp, you will be turned into a grey flake of ash. Gosh, he listened. And then you'll come to the great sea. Stormy seas, but also icy. And the ice and the sea will be piercing your legs. And if you show any sign of pain, you will drop to the bottom of the sea. Do you think you can do that? And he said, no. And he said, she said, I thought so. Listen, just take this little box of gold. Take it back to the family. Perhaps it will help you to live a better life. And so he took the little box of gold, but on leaving, he looked inside, there really was gold in there. And he thought, if I take it home, well, there are 4 of us, and if we divide it, it's not very much. It'd be much better if just one person has it, so he didn't go home. He went to the local town and lived very well. And he didn't come home, of course. And the old mother was saying, can you see your brother coming? No. So at last the second son said, well, I will go now. And he put on his straw sandals and off he went. And he came to the same mountain in the cave, and the same thing happened. The old woman told him what he would have to do, and he couldn't face it at all. And she gave him a box of gold as well, and he went to the town. You can imagine what's going to happen. The youngest son, he set off. And when the old woman in the cave told him what he had to do, he said, I will do it. My mother has to have her picture. She can't live these last days of her life so unjustly. She must have a picture. So I'll do it. He took the stone, he knocked out his 2 teeth, he put them into the stone horse, and the horse stirred, reached up, and took the 10 berries, and then was strong and vigorous. And he got on the horse, and he went up and over the fiery mountains, and the flames were licking at his legs, and he didn't flinch. He showed nothing. And came to the great sea, galloped over the great sea, and the ice was spiking his legs, but he showed nothing. And at last he came to the land of the spirit maidens of the East, and saw their palace, and went into the palace, and there were the beautiful maidens. What were they working on? They were making a copy of his mother's picture. They looked up and asked who he was, and he said, "I've come, that's my mother's picture. She must have it back again. You don't understand what you've done to her. You must give it to me." And they said, "Look, just stay here a while. We've nearly finished copying it." And they had nearly finished copying it. And they gave him a lot of fruit, which made him very, very tired. Fairy fruit often does. Be careful with the fairies when they give you food. You can be there forever. That's just a little bit of advice to you. He went into a deep sleep. And indeed, the maidens eventually had to go to bed as well. But one of the maidens had another look at the picture of the old woman. And she realized that it was more beautiful than their copy. And she loved that picture so much. And so she took her silks and she sewed a picture for herself by the pond next to the fountain. And then she went to bed. The boy, the youngest son, woke up, went out to see what was happening, and all the maidens were away, and the room was empty, and there was her mother's picture. And he thought to himself, well, I can't trust them. In any case, every moment counts. I must get home. He took the picture. He took the picture, rolled it up and held it tight. He got on the horse and he galloped over the seas with the ice spiking his legs. He showed no pain. And over the fiery mountains where the flames were licking at his legs, he didn't flinch. And came back to the cave. And then the old woman took the 2 teeth out of the horse and put them back into his mouth, and he got all his teeth again, and he got the picture, and she said, now, don't go in your straw sandals. Take these deerskin shoes. You'll soon be home. And he took just a few paces, and he was home. Where was his mother? She was in the house. The poor old thing was lying there in the darkness. He said, Mother, Mother, I have your picture. And he led her outside. And this time they were very careful. They rolled open the picture again. But as they rolled it this time, it spread. It became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so the lawns were there, spreading out. And the flower gardens were there, spreading out. And then the house, the big house, with the red pillars and the green walls and the blue roof. And the orchard on one side with the red fruit and the vegetable garden, with the green cabbages and the yellow melons. And the pond, the clear pond with the fish and the fountain. But then they saw by the fountain was a beautiful young woman. And the old woman said, who are you? And she said, please excuse me, I'm one of the spirit maidens who took your picture. And when I looked at your picture, I loved it so much, I wanted to live there. Well, you can imagine what happened. The young man fell in love with the girl, the spirit maiden. Of course they got married. Of course they got married, and they had a wonderful wedding. And in the celebrations, they invited in all the neighbors who had been helping to look after the poor old woman while the boys were away. They had a wonderful time. And they didn't notice 2 beggars, the brothers, now with no money, 2 beggars walking along the road outside and peering through the gate and realizing that that was their family, but feeling too ashamed to go in, and continuing and dragging their sticks in the dust behind them. There is the story that Koleji told me. Now, isn't storytelling amazing? Let's just stop for a moment. I'm an old Englishman living in Hungary, coming to Istanbul. And I tell you this story. But why can I tell you this story? Because many years ago, a Chinese farmer, a woman, illiterate, sold her fattest pig so she could buy a radio to give to her husband. And with the radio, her husband could learn English from Voice of America and BBC World Service. And he became an English teacher. And the years went by, and he went to the BBC summer school, and then I met him. And then years later, I can stand on this stage and tell you the story, which all came about by a Chinese farmer selling a fat pig. We never know what's going to happen with stories, do we? We're made of stories and make each other of stories. Right. Now, a Scottish man. I'm going to tell you about somebody I met in Scotland, a storyteller. And within Britain, and I think North America, he's very well known, although he's died now, Duncan Williamson. So let me tell you a little bit about Duncan Williamson, and then I'd like to tell you one of the stories that he told me. Right. So, if you can think of this being Britain here, with England at the bottom and London down here and Manchester here, and Scotland at the top. And Glasgow is here in the top left. And above there are great inlets of sea going in. And Duncan was born in a tent on the shore of one of those sea lochs. He was born in a tent. He was born in a tent not because they were on holiday, his family, but because they were what we call traveling people. Blue eyes, fair hair. Duncan told me that they were the original Scottish people. He was born and brought up in a tent. There were, I believe, in his family 14 boys and girls. The tent, his father made the tent in September every year on the Duke of Argyll's estate by cutting branches, driving them in, and bending them over, bending another one that way. And as the family grew, each year they could make the tent bigger. In the old days, they covered the tent with seal skins. But when Duncan was a boy, it was canvas. And they had a fire in the tent. There was no electricity. It was just dark in the evenings, in those winter evenings. Gosh, I met him in Edinburgh. There was a storytelling festival in the early 1990s. And at that time, I'd started to tell stories in schools and so on, but I needed to meet other storytellers and great storytellers that I could learn from. And I heard there was going to be a festival in Edinburgh, so I went there, but I was just in the audience. And when the show was over, all the storytellers were going out for the evening to have a Koleji, what's called a Koleji, when they would get together and share stories with each other. And as they were going out, Duncan was walking past me, he didn't know me, and he stopped, and he put his arm through mine and said, "Who are you?" I said, "Andrew." He said, "Andrew, come with us." So that's how I got to know Duncan Williamson. He took me to my first Koleji. The beginning of the Koleji, he said, "Now you must tell us a story, sing us a song, or show your bum or away you gang." That's how they begin their Kolejis. So we all had to tell stories or sing songs. But I got to know Duncan. He told me about being born and brought up in the tent. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. You might find this interesting, that a man from, well, he is just dead, but he's in the time when you've been alive, he was living there in this way, in Europe. It's amazing. Every morning when they got up, they had to go to school. Every morning they went down onto the shore of the loch, all the children. They had to find food for their lunch. The parents didn't give them any food. And so he said we could find little shellfish, limpets, for example. They might be lucky enough to find a fish in the pool, or a crab, and seaweed. He said when we were children, he said it was easy to find food. Years later, when he became a famous storyteller, he went back with a television team to the same place, and he showed them that there was almost no food left there. It would have been very difficult. Times change. And then he said we went to school and with our food, and when the village children went home for their lunch, whatever the weather, we jumped over the wall of the school into the field next door and lit a fire, and we had our food. It could be raining or snowing, but we were the traveler children. And funnily enough, we were never ill. When the other village children were having their coughs and colds, we all seemed to be fit as fiddles. And of course, they had nothing else but stories. in the darkness of the tent. What else could they have but stories? What do we all need, whether there are lights or just darkness? We need stories. He told me that his father, in their family, it was the father and the old auntie who was told stories. He said his auntie wore a long dress, long black dress with a thick leather belt, and hanging from the belt there was a pouch. And she called it her pocket. It had one button on it. And when the children asked, "Dad, Auntie, will you be telling us a story this evening?" And the auntie would undo the button of her pocket and say, "Let me see what we've got in here." And she put her fingers in, and then she told them stories. Now, let me see, yes. I've got time, perhaps, for one story. Yes. So let me tell you the story which Duncan's auntie took out of her little pocket. The word you really need to know in this story, just make sure, is the word for the animal which we call a seal. It's a sea animal. A sea animal. It doesn't eat people like a shark. It's a very gentle animal. When they put their heads out of the water, they have lovely big eyes. They look beautiful, almost human. And if you can imagine in Scotland, where people living in very remote places, either farms or fishermen, not seeing many people, perhaps going out to sea and seeing the seals putting their head out of the water, looking curiously at the fishermen. You can imagine them thinking, these are seal people, not just seals. So the story is about seals. And it's set, here's Scotland, on the islands up here. Rory MacCodrum. Rory MacCodrum was a fisherman, and he lived on the island of Benary. He lived alone. There was nobody else on the island. It was just his croft, his little cottage, and his boat. Now, Rory's father and his grandfather had seen the seal people on that one day in the year when they came to the shore and took off their seal skins and danced and played on the shore. He'd never seen them. He longed to see them. And one day he came out of his cottage, croft, out of his little croft, and he heard the sound of people laughing and playing and shouting. And that was very unusual because nobody lived on the island. He thought, visitors. He was a shy man. And so crouching, he went to some rocks to peep over at the shore. He peeped over and he saw 12, 13, 14 young men and women playing in the waves, dancing about, chasing. Visitors, he thought. He looked for their boat, but there was no boat. And as he crouched there by the rocks, he saw just beneath some rocks nearby were the rolled up skins of the seal people, black and white and silver gray and golden brown. His father and his grandfather had never seen the skins. And he took one of them. He took a golden brown seal skin. And bending, he went back to his croft and shut the door. And then he stood there holding it. He wasn't sure what to do with it, but he felt he must hide it. And just above the door, the thatch of the roof came down, just above the door. And he pushed it under the thatch so it couldn't be seen. And then he sat down by his fire and was mending his nets, which is what he always did in the evenings. And as he was mending his net, there was a knock at the door. But how could that be? Nobody lived on the island. He went to the door, and standing there in the door was one of the seal people, a seal maiden. Her long golden brown hair hiding her comeliness. And she said, mortal man, please help me, for I can't find my sealskin. I can't go back to the sea with my brothers and sisters. And he knew that it was just above her head, but he couldn't give it to her. He was so alone on the island. He longed for a wonderful wife, and she was so beautiful standing there. He couldn't give it to her. He said, come inside. Sit down. And he put a blanket, a plaid, around her shoulders. And then she looked up again and said, mortal man, please help me. For I've lost my sealskin, and without it I cannot return to the sea with my brothers and sisters. And he couldn't give it to her. At last he said, stay and be my wife, for I will love you all my life. Without you, I cannot live on this earth. Without my skin, I can't return to the sea. So, I will marry you. And so they married. And they came to love each other. And they had a basket full of bairns. They had lots of children with lovely golden brown hair. And just as the mother used to sing sad songs as she walked by the sea, so the children learned to sing those same sad songs. They became known as Roramacodra's seal children. And the years went by and the children grew. Until one day, as Roy was going out to his boat, a hare, not a rabbit. The rabbit's the one that lives underground, and the hare is the one that runs above the ground. It looks like a rabbit. A hare bounded in front of Rory. And in those days in Scotland, that was considered to be bad luck. And he thought, should I go back home? No, I'll go out to sea. If the wind freshens, then I'll come back. And he went out to sea, and sure enough, the wind did freshen, became strong, and the little boat was tipping about, and so he turned around and made for home. And as he came towards the shore, he saw the children standing at the water's edge. There was no sign of his wife. He wasn't sure what had happened. He beached the boat and jumped down onto the sands and ran along to them. What is it, children? What has happened? And one of them said, there was a wind, Father. It blew open the door suddenly with a smack, and something fell from the thatch. And Mum found it, and she ran and picked it up, and she started to laugh, and she hugged it to herself. She hugged it to herself. And then she kissed us all and said, I have to go, children. I have to go. She went down to the sea and she put on this thing and she swam away. She disappeared and she hasn't come back. And she never did come back. And the years went by and the children grew up and left the island. And so Rory was once more on the island by himself. Whenever he walked along the shore or went out to sea, he was looking for the golden brown seal and remembering that time with her. So there's a story from Duncan, who was told it by his auntie, and who knows who was standing behind her that told her. And now you have the story, and I've put it into the magazine. So if you want to use it with your children in the class, then it's yours. It belongs to the people who tell it. But standing behind you as you tell it, in this case, is me. But behind me is Duncan and Duncan's auntie, and so it goes back. And you're going to hear many wonderful stories today which are being given to you, and they will become your stories. And behind you will be Jan and Tup and Joe. Thank you very much.
Everybody please give a round of applause for Andy Wright. Thank you very much, Andrew.